The embargo for the Nvidia RTX 4070 Ti Super releases today. In today's video, we're going to cover everything you want to know, everything from performance, specs, power, and gameplay, as well as a lot of productivity suite options as well. That includes things like Premiere, CAD, and some of the video encoding / streaming options. And also throughout this video, I'll be doing a direct comparison to the 4070 Ti that I received last year from Zotac. So this year we're checking out the newer version, the Trinity OC, with the 4070 Ti Super version. So as you can see, the two cards here. Now the biggest noticeable difference I think that we really should address in the room is the upgraded VRAM. Also, the TDP in both these cards are identical, which is interesting because they've packed more cores into the same die while also not increasing the power overhead, which is likely due to better binning in terms of silicon. So these very likely were 4080s that were then binned down in accordance to getting better yields. The older 4070 Ti has 7,680 CUDA cores and 12 gigabytes of that VRAM. It launched with the price of $800, and the 4070 Ti Super will be replacing that price range at exactly $800 as well. Now, I believe these cards are not MSRP versions. They'll be priced slightly higher, the ones that we'll be covering in today's video, but it is ultimately the same die. Now, the 4070 Ti Super actually has 8,448 CUDA cores and that upgraded 16 gigabytes of video memory. I think the main places you're going to start seeing this, of course, is going to be the large texture games with very high detail, as well as some of the CAD applications / productivity options when you start using these cards in more of a professional capacity. When it comes to temperature, that is really a board vendor specific attribute. So the RTX 4070 Ti Super Zotac edition, the Trinity OC edition, that's what we're going to be talking about in terms of thermal. And this card right here, we're going to be talking about those temperatures for a bit. I actually was pleasantly surprised to see temps not rise above 71. I think 71 was the highest I saw with aggressive benchmarking, aggressive heat testing, aggressive thermal testing, power testing, all of that. I saw about 71 degrees max, which is actually really reasonable and does mean there's a little bit of overhead if you wanted to overclock a little bit. But then again, there is some overclocking already done at the factory. So interestingly enough, both these cards have the exact same TDP. That means that while the RTX 4070 Ti Super has more CUDA cores, it actually has the same amount of power consumption. I know one of the biggest concerns with last year when the 4090s came out was the fact that the 12-pin connector was a little concerning with the amount of power that it was pulling. There was people complaining that they were having some burnt wires. They were having some concerns in that regard. And I've had my 4070 Ti here that uses the same amount of watts for the last year, and there was no issues with my cable. However, I think that also, since having the same wattage, we should be just fine in terms of that. Now, that's speaking from my personal experience, and I also did test this card a little bit as well, and I didn't have any issues, but it is always something to bring up since that was a big concern last year, and people have always mentioned that going in with the higher cards. I haven't seen that issue, at least in my testing and my experience. And when it comes to the real-world power consumption of what I actually saw when playing this, I saw when I was pretty much maxing out the card in some games, I was seeing roughly around 265 to 270 watts of usage. And then if you start throwing this in like some benchmarking software, you can get closer up to that 185 watts. I think I got up to like 182. And then again, that was also at that 71 degrees Celsius thermal area. So I thought that this was rather decent given all things considered and the sheer amount of power that this is having to cool. I did notice that the fan noise on here was a little larger, a little louder than what was on the previous year's card. But then again, you can compare the size of these suckers. This is much, much smaller, at least smaller by a good enough margin than what we had last year. I don't think that the noise was too ridiculous. And you can hear some videos of what it sounded like when we were running some pretty extensive benchmarks. Interestingly enough, when running our tests in Premiere, it looked like both of these were pretty much identical in terms of how fast they could render out a timeline. This was the identical timeline. This was actually our unboxing of this card. And overall, there really wasn't any difference. There was a couple differences when you start having a lot of elements or large timelines. And I think that's probably due to the VRAM, but then again, it was extremely negligible, and I'd say it's probably within 1%, so I said margin of error. The only time we really saw the extra VRAM being used was in CAD, and that was of course in large projects with a lot of different parts. So I'd say obviously you should know if you're using CAD software, you're going to need a lot of VRAM. That's why a lot of people go with Quadros anyway. So interestingly, out of all the benchmarking, Fortnite Rocket Racers was actually, we saw the biggest difference based off of VRAM. We saw more VRAM utilization, still not maxing out the 12 gigabytes that the 4070 Ti has, but there was some difference, which was very weird. Also, if you want to check out the full breakdown and explanation about Fortnite, we have a dedicated video on that as well, benchmarking it. Now moving on to Lego Fortnite, we actually saw the same thing kind of repeated. We saw about 1.5 gigs more VRAM utilization on Lego Fortnite, and we also saw a little bit higher FPS, on average about 10 FPS higher, which I thought was interesting to say the least. And then in an actual combat situation, I actually saw about 10 FPS higher depending on the situation. Some environments like the snowy environment were a little higher, obviously, on average between the two cards. But in certain circumstances, there was, again, a little bit of a difference between the two cards. And I want to attribute that to the VRAM, but I'm not quite sure if it was just my testing setup or what it was. But I felt like at least the VRAM made a difference, at least marginally by 5 FPS or so, when you have your settings maxed out. Now, I will say one thing about the 4070 Ti Super when it comes to playing Fortnite. If you enable DLSS, then you can pretty much max out every setting and obtain 60 FPS at 4K, which I think is a pretty reasonable for most people. And then, of course, you could knock that down even farther to get something like 144 if you have a high refresh rate monitor. Now real quick, we're going to switch gears to Minecraft, and before you guys go, oh, Minecraft isn't intensive at all, no, we're actually going to mod it up real quick. So starting off, RTX shaders on Bedrock Edition, did not see any difference really, slightly higher VRAM usage, but overall the two cards pretty much performed identically. Then again, it has a FPS cap anyway, so I'd say that Minecraft Bedrock did not use the GPU at all, and since we can't mod it, there's not really much we can do. It looks this way, that's what we're stuck with. However, if we actually look at the VRAM usage on this bad boy, I modded this up with a mod called Nvidia, as well as the Distant Horizons mod, and this actually maxes out the VRAM on the RTX 4070 Ti Super. So that means that I can load up to, I think, 1,024 chunks in each direction, and you're looking at this right now, which is wild. So it actually fully utilizes it. And of course then there is an actual difference between the two cards, but you did have to kind of try for it. And then of course when it comes to actually rendering out just traditional shaders with some cool texture packs, there is about a 5 to 10% difference in the FPS that you will get with the different texture packs. Now here we arrive of whether or not you should buy it. This is always a fun one to watch people try to explain away whether or not you should or should not buy something. I think that's a hard judgment or hard thing to do if you are also receive something for free. You didn't have to pay for it. I think for me, I definitely would have, if I was in the market for a graphics card and the 4070 Ti came out, and then also the 4070 Ti Super came out, I definitely would pay for the extra video memory just for the fact that that has a long proven history of making a difference when it comes to longevity of cards. The 4070 Ti is rumored to be dropping by $50. If that's the case, there's some serious value proposition to actually paying the extra $50 just for the VRAM. And the 4070 Ti Super is going to replace the 4070 Ti and be $800. I think it's been very interesting, specifically with some of the games that we've tested, that points to the additional VRAM actually making a difference, more than I expected it to. And I feel like we're in a situation where the 4070 Ti would be a better card if it just had more VRAM, let alone the additional CUDA cores. It was very interesting to see that Fortnite substantially benefited at times with the extra VRAM and actually used a little bit more. It was interesting to see that some of the mods that we used in Minecraft actually utilized the additional VRAM to load more area. And as we go through and test more games and add that on to the addition of this review down below, we'll go through and test more and more games. But out of those that we've been testing, it seems that there is a trend, at least, with games just more willing to use the extra VRAM. And it's not because the industry or the games wouldn't use it. It's quite apparent, at least in this, that they would. So I feel like the mid-range cards being stuck at 12 gigabytes is no longer enough. And once upon a time that was 8. So I feel like 12 gigabytes is starting to seems bottlenecked in certain ways, at least from the comparisons and stuff that we've looked at today. I've also included 2 dedicated videos, one going into depth about Minecraft testing and the other one going into depth about Fortnite testing. I've included the links to those both in the description. You can check those out. I'll also include a link to the 4070 Ti review that I did last year. And thank you very much for watching.